Those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat all its foolish mistakes. So we have a lot to learn. Over the 100 years of our province, Passionists have stood by the cross, and they've done it in many different ways, facing many different challenges. In Christianity, the central place always belongs to the cross. In each of the 4 Gospels, the whole story leads up to Jerusalem, to the cross, and finally the resurrection. The Passionists were founded by St. Paul of the Cross in 1721. As a youth, Paul was captivated by the love of God for us, shining forth in the suffering, in the passion of Jesus Christ. For him, it was the most stupendous work of God's love. He was a great mystic. He divided his life between intense penance and contemplation on the one hand, and preaching in simple, plain language to the suffering, the ordinary people, the neglected people, the people on the margin, the peasants who were so despised. I'm here to talk about what we can learn from those 100 years of the history of the province in these lands of the Holy Spirit. They say that those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat all its foolish mistakes. So we have a lot to learn. A Passionist is someone who's deeply aware of human brokenness. You know, Shakespeare's Hamlet said, "What a piece of work is man." And he goes on and on about how wonderful we are. And we can say, yeah, the Passionists, they're wonderful, they're great. But we have to tell the whole story. We have to look at us in the fullness of our humanity, including the things that didn't go so well. The underside. When we were failing, broken, weak, fearful, selfish, and sometimes downright evil. In 1946, when I walked through the door at St. Ives, the province was already 23 years old. So I don't remember the whole story, but the people I met along the way bridged much of that gap. There was Father Alphonsus, the provincial, with his loud, booming voice, self-taught theologian, builder. He stopped by sometimes. Then there was Brother Stephen. He was the cook. And he loved entertaining us, feeding us to the best that he could on a very tight budget, full of jokes. Damien Kavanagh was a student director. He was the one to look after us. And you know, I arrived there full of joy, and then suddenly I was homesick. Farm and family so far away in South Australia, and I needed encouragement. Damien was always there for us, like a father and mother, a very good man. And there was Bede O'Brien, the superior, elderly, in poor health, recovering from a heart attack, plagued by scruples, yet joyful in his love of God. He was a gardener, growing tomatoes and different vegetables for us. He was full of wonderful stories, some from the Middle East, the excavations of ancient civilizations that were taking place in the 1920s when he was involved, giving us whole new insights into the background of the Bible itself. Once, Father Bede welcomed to the house his friend, the Patriarch Mark Ivanios of the Syro-Malankara Church, which he, the Patriarch, had brought into communion with Rome in 1930 after an existence of almost 19 centuries. He came into the student study room, placed his beautiful turban on the mantelpiece while he talked to us. Then he was off with Bede, leaving the turban. So there was one naughty little boy went up and picked up the turban and tried it on. It fitted very well. In the earliest years of the new province, Bede was the one who built the church and the monastery at Glen Osmond. And I remember vividly Bede giving us youngsters a talk about the Trinity, something usually guaranteed to put anyone to sleep. Not with Bede. You know, theology students plow through deep dissertations on the Trinity. Bede cut to the core in a kind of crescendo with his whole body. There's only one God. God is creator, giving birth eternally to the Son. The Son is the one who saves us, redeems us. And the Spirit. When he got to the Spirit, he was eyes lit up, his voice trembled but strongly as he exulted in the emergence of the Spirit, bringing us light and love. What Bede conveyed can't be done in writing. Came from the heart, from his own life of prayer. And I mentioned Bede not because he was the only one, simply because I had the privilege of knowing him among the many wonderful people who have filled up this century. Many of them, their stories should be written. A glance through the years of the province reveals a kaleidoscope of different ways of living and of preaching the gospel. We've changed again and again and again. How can we make sense of such changes? I think it may have been the priest sociologist Andrew Greeley gave advice to congregations trying to modernize. He said, stick to your knitting. What did he mean? Your knitting is the thing you know best. And if you identify the thing you know best, find how it can be expressed within the context of today. And that's what we had to do time and time again. Identify our knitting. And that was not hard to do. We are passionists. The passion of Jesus is at the core of whatever we do. And we've done so many different things. At the time the province was created, passionists were taking care of a whole string of parishes in Adelaide. But a decree went forth that all of them must return to the monastery. In order for it to be a province, the monastery had to be a house of prayer. And all the members present rise at 2:00 every morning, different hours of prayer all through the day, long periods of meditation, silence. So I think looking back, it was a mistake, a foolish decision, because our knitting, Our true vocation, our charism, can be expressed in many different ways. We are not a monastic order. We are not called to live our whole life within the monastery walls. We are a congregation of both contemplative and active life. That decision in Adelaide was so difficult, but they weathered the change. Times were difficult because of with the end of the parishes, the income also disappeared. It was very hard to put food on the table. And then came the Great Depression, and it was certainly just as hard for us as for many other people to stay alive, to have enough to eat. The real story has to be how those men were faithful, ultimately, to our vocation as Passionists. And they went forth from that house of prayer to preach missions. And you know that in the next 10 years, quite a large group of young men in South Australia joined the Passionist congregation. They made good out of a difficult situation. Many a time, the same thing has happened. We've run into difficulty, but somehow, through the faithfulness of our brethren, good has come out of it. We take a vow of poverty. That means embracing simple living in imitation of Jesus. We keep the community by sharing everything, and the community keeps us, all of us, equally. In the early years, we experienced real poverty. We've not been immune to the Catholic Church's scourge of abuse. These things happened in secret in our midst, not coming to light for many years, till victims finally spoke out. Indeed, the Australian Royal Commission rightly asked who knew what, who allowed a cover-up. In shame, we admit that the wolf attacking the flock was one of us, in our very midst, beside us at the table, beside us as we knelt in prayer, while out of sight, destroying the lives of the innocent, God's little ones. The damage to individuals was terrible. And yet, by a miracle, some survivors have, with help, learned to deal with the trauma, to overcome. And they have emerged as Passionists in the deepest sense, persons who have, like Jesus, shared in the world's suffering and shared in his resurrection. With eyes wide open at last, the province is learning the bitter lesson of the past and begun to move forward towards a better future. Strict protocols are in place. There's a policy of supervision and vigilance. For candidates to join us, there is a policy of psychological assessment and careful ongoing discernment. All these are safeguards aimed at keeping the problem at bay. At another level, the lesson from this whole sordid business goes deeper to conversion, to having a heart set on God, in love with the Lord Jesus, placing the poor and the weak above ourselves. Pope Francis has named a certain mindset in the church as clericalism, a sense of privilege, a sense of entitlement, an expectation of immunity from scrutiny and accountability. Everyone who has passed through the church's seminary system has been exposed to it, and we tend to take for granted our privileged rank. People around us have in different ways supported us in this dangerous delusion, trusting us completely, more than we deserve. As we struggle to reform, we need you to tell us the truth. Bring us down to earth. Speak up when we cross a line. Make sure we do not forget history's hard lesson. Our numbers grew rapidly during the 1950s and 60s. We took on new places, new projects. The congregation grew in many ways. In 1 Corinthians, the Apostle Paul wrote, "Jews demand signs and Greeks desire wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles." I joined a congregation that wore this saying like a banner. We preach Christ crucified. We knew ourselves as preachers of parish missions. Everything pointed to that. Among us were many great preachers. As I was preparing this presentation, I met a diocesan priest who told me that when he was a kid, he was totally enthralled by the preaching of Father Norbert. He stood on a platform in the middle of the church with his own huge crucifix beside him. He knew how to hold the rapt attention of young and old alike. They were proud days, but with the Second Vatican Council, they came to a sudden end. But we stuck to our knitting. Passion has found ways to respond to the hunger for the good news in new ways. The lesson of history was that there can be more than one way to preach Christ crucified, and that we need to identify ways that respond to the situation of the moment. In 1955, 4 Passionists went to then New Guinea. They helped out with the Divine Word missionaries, waiting till finally, in early 1961, the Passionists took possession or responsibility for their own mission at Vanimo. In a short time, several new mission stations were founded in the interior under difficult conditions. Sometimes it was a struggle to survive. Long journeys were on foot, sometimes in pathless jungle, following pig trails and streams, in water, in mud, or on dangerous rocks. Always the inhabitants of the tiny villages of flimsy houses gave us a great welcome, offering us sugarcane or coconuts. Of course, they greeted us in their own village language, one of over 850 different languages in a small country. They were open to the gospel, but often the only language was our actions. And we rapidly built schools, medical clinics, provided lots of service and assistance, and slowly established a community of peace between warring tribes. I myself gave out all kinds of medicine and lots of penicillin injections, knowing practically nothing. From time to time, mail and essential supplies were dropped from a plane. although gradually the missionaries managed to construct landing strips for planes to come in and connect us to the world. The Passions team in New Guinea grew rapidly. Our education and medical programs expanded and achieved a level of excellence. Struggling with the challenge of many languages, our missionaries began to communicate at last, to preach in words, and many were baptized. Not all our men flourished under those harsh conditions, cut off from home, enduring loneliness, culture shock, language barriers, malaria, and other health hazards. The hot, humid climate, not to mention misunderstandings and impossible tasks. Yet they poured themselves out with courage, generosity, and most of all, with love for the people who were, of course, far worse off than us. The Vietnam mission, begun in 2005 by our Rome leadership, was entrusted to the care of the province in 2015, and great effort has gone into its development. Others can tell that story. In 1922, all our communities based in Sydney, Adelaide, and Goulburn, New South Wales, followed strict monastic observance, rising at 2 a.m. to chant matins, keeping up the other liturgical hours spread through the day. The brethren only spoke during brief recreation periods after meals. There was other daily prayers and penances, and of course always an hour dedicated to contemplative prayer focused on the passion of Jesus. We kept the observance. Then came the Second Vatican Council. Great changes began in the church. The younger religious and candidates were swept up in the enthusiasm of the council's vision of an open and free church where the dignity of the baptized was rediscovered. Religious were asked to take a sharp look at themselves, to recover the vibrancy and innovation which had characterized their founding, and enter into dialogue with the world. Among us, as throughout most of the universal church, many religious, liberated from a compelling sense of guilt, shame, or fear, no longer saw the point of religious life, and they came to recognize their true calling in a different way of life, and they freely moved on. Those who remained took part in a remarkable transformation or rebirth of the congregation. Amid daunting challenges and confusion, with plenty of mistakes, great struggles and much pain, there was serious study of the origins of our charism, a process referred to by Vatican II as ressourcement, rediscovering our roots in the gospel and in our congregation's foundation story. Our revised rule states that we are called to live together in order to proclaim the gospel of Christ. In other words, our community life is meant to be our greatest witness. They used to say, see how these Christians love one another. Sometimes we do the same. A life lived for others. We look deeply at the traditional idea of penance with its many severe practices, including beating our souls with the discipline, sometimes shedding blood. We began to see that the gospel is inviting us not so much to hurt ourselves as to give deeply from the heart every day in a new life lived for others. As time changed and our members were pouring themselves heart and soul into the many amazing new ministries, making God known through the gift Jesus made of himself in his passion, they found themselves rushing from place to place, working all hours, not able to rise at 2 a.m. for matins or fill their day with all the rest of the full observance. But they were in full-on active ministry. In some cases, the pendulum had swung from one extreme to the other, and both extremes hurt us and distracted us from our mission. History taught us the importance of finding a true balance between contemplation and action in the spirit of St. Paul of the Cross. I did all my high school studies with the Passionists at St. Ives in Sydney, taught by our own members. Later, theology school was the same, all in-house, taught by our own good men. Many teachers were excellent, some trained at great expense in Rome, but classes of 2 or 3 were normal. For generations, we wasted precious resources in this way, sticking to tradition. After the Vatican Council, when suddenly everything seemed possible, we did the obvious, cooperated with other congregations, and out of that cooperation arose Yarrow Theological Union, which has served us and many others so well for the last 50 years. You must know some of the wonderful creative passionist initiatives that have continued to emerge since the Council. Sometimes our men were denounced for heresy while they were preaching or helping people understand the teachings of the Second Vatican Council. There was resistance, but we were at the cutting edge. Great work was done in youth retreats. A new form of parish missions emerged. Instead of roaring fire and brimstone from the pulpit, the missionaries met together with small groups in private homes, expounding the gospel, helping people understand it more deeply, listening to their stories. With newfound joy, Passionists were soon proclaiming the gospel to youth in school camps. Passionists were to be found in hospitals, in prisons, among factory workers, sitting down with the indigenous people, hearing their stories, in refugee camps, even in the newspapers and on TV. We still preach the passion of Jesus Christ, but now joyfully bringing out his suffering as solidarity with the crucified of today, as an invitation to love, no longer as a guilt trip. Lay people began to join with the professed religious in taking on the Passionist charism for their life and prayer and in outreach to the world. Passionists is still known as down to earth and human, but not so strict anymore. Our congregation has always treasured parents and benefactors. There have also been those who are drawn by our style, in fact, our charism, which they often call down to earth, rooted in the joy and the pain of life, life as it is lived. So they want to associate themselves with our communities and our spirituality. We've come to see the tremendous potential of sharing our charism explicitly with all who are interested. And this is sticking to our knitting. In family groups, in the youth retreat team, in Passion as Companions, and in other settings, the torch is being passed. The message of the Passion is alive and spreading, just when the core membership is in collapse. So sad. Back in the day, they said we were the strictest order in the church. Well, not anymore. Somebody opened a window and let in light and fresh air. We do stick to our knitting, but this means honoring in new ways the same ideals that were generously served by those who went before us. Clinging to those ideals, to the Passionist instinct to connect suffering hearts to the love that led Jesus to embrace the cross, right there, we have learned something from history.